Good afternoon and welcome everybody to the National Association for Pastoral Care and Education's annual national conference, Does Every Child Still Matter? A New Approach to Education. My name is Phil Jones. I'm the National Chair of NAPCE, and it's a great pleasure for me to welcome you to what is our second online event, but it's our first ever conference online, so it could be an interesting experience. So we'll see how we go. A few sort of housekeeping things to start with. If I can ask you please to keep your mic on mute unless you're speaking, and that just takes away the difficulty with any sort of background noise or as we've seen, cats arriving or children arriving or anything like that. So please keep your mic on mute unless speaking. You can find the mic button by just moving your mouse, and it's a little old-fashioned microphone icon. Just click on that. We're very happy for delegates to keep your cameras on. We suggest that you use the option who's talking, so that you'll then not see everybody, you'll just see the person who's actually doing the presentation at that particular time. So that will be useful. Please use the chat function if you want to put any questions or make any comments. We are going to be quite busy this afternoon, moving quite quickly, but if we have time, we'll look at them this afternoon. If not, we might have an opportunity to look at them later as part of the conference, or to share your views, share your ideas on Twitter. And I'll show you the Twitter link for the conference in a few minutes. We are going to be recording the conference, so if you're joining us live, a big welcome. Really pleased that you're here live. If you're joining us on catch-up, then I hope England won the football, but we'll wait and see what happens about that. If you lose the link, we are in the wonderful world of the internet, and unfortunately it does happen sometimes, then please give it a minute to see if it comes back. If that doesn't work, then what seems to work is if you go out of the link and come back in again, then it seems to reconnect you. So that's where we are. So I'll tell you a little bit about the conference. The first part of the conference is this afternoon, where we're going to be looking at 3 presentations. And the first of those will be by Professor Caitlin Mendes and her colleague, who's with us this afternoon, Dr. Tanya Horek, who's waving. Welcome, Tanya. The second presentation will be from some good partners of NAPCE, the Thrive approach, and they're going to be talking about promoting social and emotional well-being. And the final presentation today, on the first day of the conference, will be by Connor Acton, who's going to be talking about pastoral care post-COVID. Tomorrow night, as part of the conference, we have a very exciting event where we have taken your questions from the delegates and from people who are members of NAPCE to put to a very distinguished international panel of experts with different backgrounds in pastoral care and involved in working with young people. And that starts at 8 o'clock tomorrow night. So please join us for that. Have yourself a nice glass of wine, relax, sit back and take part in the question time. And the final day of the conference is on Friday. This time it's in the morning. And the presentations you can see on screen there are about building positive relationships for learning, and that's from Helen Peter. Second presentation is Proactive Pastoral Care, who's from Maria O'Neill, who's recently published a book on proactive pastoral care. And the final presentation is from somebody called Phil Jones. No idea who he is, but he's going to be talking about engaging learners. And we hope that lots of people will join in during the conference. Please send any comments that you've got to the Twitter page. NAPCE Twitter page is at NAPCE1. The conference hashtag is NAPCECon21. Please engage in the conference and get involved as much as you possibly can. We're very pleased to have you here. So I think that was all I was going to do for now. Yes, so I'm now going to try and unshare my screen, which is an interesting challenge. And I'm going to go to who's talking. So while I'm doing that, I think I'll do the bit that worries me most, which is sending the share to our first speaker. And hopefully I've now made our first speakers the presenters, and I'll be able to share their PowerPoints with everybody. So a little bit ahead of time, which is always good because you don't want to listen to me talking. I'm very, very pleased to introduce our first presentation this afternoon, which is on the very current title of Combating Online Sexual Harassment, Why We Need Relationship and Sex Education More Than Ever. And this presentation is going to cover some of the current thinking, some fantastic research that's been done by Caitlin and by Tanya and other colleagues who contributed to that as well. And I'm very pleased to have them this afternoon. If I can introduce Caitlin first. Caitlin Mendes is a professor of gender, media and sociology at the University of Leicester. She is an expert on feminist activism and has written over 50 publications around this topic, including the book Slut Walk, Feminism, Activism and Media and Digital Feminist Activism. Girls and Women Fight Back Against Rape Culture with Jessica Ringrose and Jessalyn Keller. She is currently leading 2 projects, so not just one, but 2, with young people in schools, exploring online gendered harms and risks and how we can teach young people to safely navigate digital space and speak out about issues that matter to them. And Caitlin is joined this afternoon by her colleague Tanya Horrocks, who is an associate professor in film, media and culture at Anglia Ruskin University in the UK. She writes on binge writing, celebrity culture, crime, internet memes, social justice and social media, and is the author of Public Rape Representing Violation in Fiction and Film and Justice on Demand, True Crime in Digital Screaming Era. Her current research projects include an AHRC funding study on online sexual risks for young people during COVID-19 and a British Academy funded study on the rise of consent culture and intimacy coordination. So I think you can see that they are expertly qualified to talk today at the conference. The thinking behind the conference is that we want to explore whether it is time to revisit the Every Child Matters agenda, which was very prominent in the 1990s, as a starting point to reset thinking about education. And our first presentation is very, very important for that. So I'm going to hand over to Caitlin and Tanya.
Okay, thank you so much, Phil, and it's great to be here. Thank you for having us. Katie, if it's okay, I'll just ask you to go to through the slides. Okay, thank you. So we're part of a team of feminist academics and sex educators who are working, as Phil suggested, on a number of projects related to online sexual and gendered harms, young people, and schools. And one of our current projects assesses the impact of COVID-19 and social isolation on young people's experiences of online sexual risks and gendered harms. So we're currently in the middle of doing fieldwork across 5 secondary school sites in the UK, doing surveys, focus groups, workshops, and interviews. And that's posing its own challenges because there keeps being COVID outbreaks. But anyways, the central aim of our research is to tackle the problem of online sexual harassment and violence in the digital era, and to help teachers deal with the growing problem of image-based sexual abuse. So while concerns over digital violence are not new, lockdown conditions for COVID-19 have exacerbated the potential for harm with increased screen time, and recent events in the UK have brought them to a crisis point. So in our talk today, we want to make the case for the importance of a revamped 21st century relationships and sex education that supports young people as they navigate the complexities of the digital world. So as you can see from the slide that's up on the screen at the moment, it's not an exaggeration to say that we're in the midst of a full-scale crisis in the UK over sexual abuse in schools. Following the murder of 33-year-old Sarah Everard at the beginning of March 2021, there was widespread social outrage over the violence faced by young girls and women. And if you could just go to the next slide, please, Katie. In the wake of this, the Instagram page and website, Everyone's Invited, had a dramatic surge in testimonies from students, mainly girls, but not only girls. And these testimonies reference rape and sexual harassment they have experienced. Everyone's Invited was set up by 22-year-old Soma Sara in June 2020 with the express goal of exposing and eradicating rape culture, which normalizes and excuses violence against girls and women. And since the murder of Sarah Everard, the testimonies have just gone through the roof. And I don't know if any of you have had a chance to look at this website, but it makes for very difficult reading. Some of the testimonies name schools where abuse and harassment took place. And some of the testimonies call schools to task for not providing good enough sex education on things like consent. Many of the testimonies recount the non-consensual sharing of nude images and videos on smartphones. As recounted, girls are often coerced online into sharing nude images of themselves. They are harassed by partners and peers into sending these photos. The next slide, please, Katie. Our UK survey of 336 young people in 2020 found that 32% of girls said they'd received a photo of a penis that they didn't want, a dick pic, as they're called. Also called cyber flashing, this increased during lockdown and is often a gateway to more violence and abuse. If you could just go to the next slide, please, Katie. Thank you. So here's some stats from a follow-up survey that we did as well. So this is all quite alarming. And the question is, what do we do? What is the answer? How can relationships and sex education help to tackle the ever-growing problem of online sexual harassment amongst young people? Next slide, please, Katie. So back in the 1980s, when I was growing up, sex education was pretty poor, to be honest. There tended to be a birds and bees abstinence-based approach, which was woefully inadequate. And this slide from the Hollywood film Mean Girls just about sums it up. Don't have sex because you'll get pregnant and die. So when we say that we need RSC more than ever, what we mean is that we need a retooled 21st century RSC, which foregrounds digital literacy and the increasing lack of distinction between online and offline for young people. The next slide, please, Katie. So, yeah, that's just an example of, I don't know if any of you have seen the Netflix show, Sex Education, but that's just an example of what the kind of education that we would be more advocates of. If you could just go to the next slide as well, Katie, thank you. So we work closely with the School of Sexuality Education. Sorry, just the one before, yeah, there you go. That's the charity that we work closely with, and a number of stakeholders to research online sexual harassment and to explore the close links, as I mentioned, between online and offline forms of abuse. And what's key for us is that we listen to young people and we support them. Too often, young people don't disclose experiences they have because of victim blaming and a very punitive, heavy-handed responses that they receive from schools. So that's something that we want to shift. We want there to be a shift in the culture. So before we proceed further, it's important for us to define what we mean by some of these terms we're using. So if we could just go to the next slide, please, Katie. And we need to define online sexual harassment. So what is online sexual harassment? Well, it refers to a range of behaviors where digital technologies are used to facilitate both virtual and face-to-face sexually based harms. It can refer to any unwanted sexual content on any digital platform. And it's important that this is recognized as sexual violence. It happens online, but it's still a form of sexual violence. And there are three main categories of online sexual harassment. So the first, thank you, Katie, is image-based sexual abuse, which is also called IBSA. And image-based sexual abuse refers to taking and or sharing sexual images of someone without their consent. So this can include things like sharing nudes or sexual images without the person's consent, even if those images were initially taken and shared with consent. And it's important to acknowledge that young people, and not only young people, but young people prevalently do share intimate images as part of their relationships. And that's fine when it's in a consensual context. But what sometimes happens is that the relationship will break down or what have you, and these images will be shared without consent, and that's the problem. Image-based sexual abuse can also refer to hacking or stealing nudes or sexual images. You've heard of like the famous actresses who've had their accounts hacked, for example, but that can happen to ordinary people too. Recording and or sharing images of rape or sexual assault, and creating sexual images without consent. For example, the crime of upskirting, which is taking a photo up a person's skirt without their consent. And that happens in all sorts of locations, including schools and on public transport. Thank you. Next slide, Katie. Okay. And secondly, unsolicited sexual content online. This refers to any sexual content shared online which isn't wanted by the recipient. So this can include things like I was talking about earlier, nudes or dick pics. And as I said, girls especially are bombarded with dick pics, and they have sadly come to accept this as a normal part of their daily lives. Unsolicited sexual videos, messages and comments, and deliberately being shown pornography without your consent, and porn bots sending links without your consent. And boys often tell us that they're bombarded with these porn bots, which can be quite upsetting for them. The next slide, please, Katie. Okay. Sexual coercion, threats, and intimidation online. So this can include outing a person's sexuality or gender identity online without their consent, threatening to share images non-consensually. So the threat to share images is very disturbing as well, and is often part of a pattern of coercive behavior. And finally, sextortion, which you may have heard of, which is when someone, often a stranger, coerces vulnerable people like children into creating and sharing images or performing sexual acts, and then threatens them with blackmail and exposure. So while we make distinctions between these three categories, for the sake of clarity, there are evident overlaps and links. So that's how we define online sexual harassment, through those different categories that overlap. Now, how does this relate to schools? Like, how does the problem of image-based sexual abuse manifest in schools? As part of our research, we conducted interviews with safeguarding leads in March 2020. With safeguarding leads in UK secondary schools. And these interviews were really important in helping us to identify and understand the nature and scope of the problem regarding mobile phones, social media platforms, and image-based sexual abuse in a school context. And the safeguarding leads that we spoke to said they were increasingly having to deal with issues caused by social media, with one head of year suggesting that they now despite 4 out of the 7 schools banning that we spoke to, banning mobile phone use entirely during the school day, issues arising from student engagement with smartphones and social media platforms were unavoidable in a school context. And what we've found is that the problem with an abstinence-based approach to mobile phones is that it just doesn't really work because of that erosion between the online and offline that we spoke about. And that's something that COVID-19 has really brought home, hasn't it? The extent to which all of us rely on digital communication and intimacies. And whether you ban phones or not, and we want to stress very strongly that that's never the answer, these issues will continue to impact on school life. So while schools handled a wide range of social media issues, the sharing of sexually explicit images was cited as a new and pressing issue by the safeguarding leads that we spoke to. All 7 of the safeguarding leads gave examples of online sexual harassment, and 5 of them recounted specific instances of IBSA or IBSA, image-based sexual abuse, including a case of sexual imagery of a young woman being shared amongst several students without her consent, and also cases of young people in relationship exchanging intimate photos only for those images to be viewed non-consensually by others. And like there are instances of boys like showing the nude images on their phones, so not necessarily sharing them, like as in sending them, but saying, oh, hey, look at this, like in the school playground or what have you. And that kind of testimony has emerged a lot as well in the schools that I've been in just over the last few weeks. The school response to those sorts of cases has tended to be strongly reactive. And one of the key themes to emerge from the interviews we've conducted is the need for there to be a more concerted, proactive approach to tackling the problem of online sexual harassment. In the absence of specific policies regarding online sexual harassment, the educators that we spoke to just had to kind of like cobble together what they could from their existing e-safety or anti-bullying policies. And there was kind of like a piecemeal response to dealing with these troubling cases of image-based sexual abuse. And although there was an awareness of sexting, as it's called, as a practice amongst their secondary school students, a nuanced understanding of consent was absent. So sending a nude image tended to be rather simplistically framed as something that was not appropriate and that should not be done in the first place. And this sort of abstinence-based approach was in certain instances accompanied by a degree of victim blaming, however unintentional, which framed the consensual production of the images in the first place as the problem, rather than dealing with the issue of the perpetrator who shared the images without consent. So this is a big problem that we found, is that the victims are so reluctant to disclose because they know that the school, there'll be this victim blaming, or the police, this heavy-handed phone, bring in the police approach that we don't really advocate for. So safeguarding leads also spoke of the struggle to manage and track the escalation of image spreading between peers in the school. And that was that quote that I have on the slide here about, this was from a safeguarding lead, about how they had an ongoing case at the moment with a student whose image has been shared, and it just got out of control, the image sharing, and they had to involve the police. But what we found is that with this sort of punitive approach is that there's often very little victim support. So this is something that we want to address. And just as there needs to be education for students about what constitutes, about what online behaviors constitute sexual harassment and what they should do if they experience forms of online harm, we also think that there needs to be like continual education and training for teachers on the reality of what young people have to contend with in this rapidly changing digital world that we live in. As one teacher said to us in specific reference to the issue of dick pics, it's necessary for people who work in secondary schools to understand what the students have to go through and the pressures that they face and the shock value of receiving these images on their phones. So we feel that schools need support and guidance on how to deal with these incredibly complex situations, and that's why we're here today. This is not the time for knee-jerk reactions. We need to think hard, and we need to think carefully about how to combat these issues. And it's vital to draw on research to find ways to challenge certain inequities in school culture and indeed culture at large that are fostering certain damaging behaviors and attitudes. And we feel strongly that it's essential for all of us to work together to implement these better forms of digital sex education that actively involves students and which deploys a joined up whole schools approach. And over the past few weeks, I've been speaking to year 9s, and they've been telling me, many of them, especially the girls, are all aware of Everyone's Invited. And they spend a lot of time reading these deeply disturbing testimonies and discussing it amongst themselves. And many of them have told me, many of these 14-year-old girls, often I have to say I've been brought to tears in a lot of these focus groups that I do, but they've been telling me that it's been over a year and a half now since some of them have had any RSE. And they're telling us very clearly that this is a problem. They want to be talking about these issues and they want to be talking about them openly. So without further ado, I'll turn you over to my colleague, Caitlin Mendez, who will explain more about the key messages of our online sexual harassment guidance for schools and what we think needs to be done. Katie?
Okay, thank you. Okay, so like Tanya says, we're very aware of these issues, but we're also really interested in creating solutions or ways of mitigating against some of these problems. And we are doing this through working with charitable partners like the School of Sexuality Education, like ASCL, and hopefully this is the beginning of a relationship with NAPCE as well. So we recognize that the new RSE curriculum is an improvement on what was there in the past, the fact that it's mandatory now. These are all really good steps. But we argue that it doesn't go far enough. So for example, as it stands, the RSE curriculum doesn't offer any advice for teachers on how to tackle these sensitive issues like porn, sexual coercion, gender inequality, and sexual violence. And you know, most teachers don't receive any training on how to deliver RSE or PSHE in their teacher training programs as well. So it's no surprise then that without this training, a lot of teachers that we've spoken to don't feel confident in tackling these issues. They don't know how to approach them. They're scared of saying something wrong. In many cases, you know, teachers really lack this confidence. And for some teachers, it's because they aren't familiar with the social media platforms that young people are using. So maybe they're talking about Instagram or Snapchat, or the social media apps change all the time. And many teachers just aren't familiar with the applications, the technology, how it actually works. So what we are advocating is that it's not enough just to have RSE curriculum. We also need a change in school culture, which Tanya has been talking about. So in the past, we know that too many schools have been trying to cover up instances of sexual violence and sexual harassment, or they just refer them on to the police instead of having policies addressing these issues in the first place. So we argue that we need this whole school approach in fundamentally changing how schools are dealing with these issues. And at the moment, like Tanya has said, the victims are almost always the ones who are blamed. You know, why did they put themselves in that position? Why did they send that photo? Rather than questioning why someone, you know, abused them, harassed them, or was sharing content that was consensually taken without their consent. So we also need policies that understand what modern day sexual violence and harassment looks like. And what we really advocate for is that online sexual harassment and sexual violence aren't just categorized or dealt with under general bullying policies or e-bullying policies. We need schools to recognize that these sorts of practices and behaviors are actually forms of violence, they're forms of harm. Not everyone has an equal chance of being subjected to these practices, that there are very clear gender, for example, dynamics to what's going on. So we argue that part of what's needed is new policies and guidance to deal with these. And these are things that we've been working on with the School of Sexuality Education. So what we've come up with is a series of documents, and the first one is a comprehensive guidance for schools. So this is a fairly lengthy document, provides really detailed advice for schools on how to deal with this issue of online sexual harassment. So it explains what it is, what it looks like, and the impact of these different harassments on pupils. And I should say that all of these resources that I'm talking about are freely available on the School of Sexuality's website. And again, the document argues that we need this whole school joined up approach. We need to move to a more consent-oriented education rather than this abstinence approach that Tanya's mentioned. And the document concludes with recommendations for schools on, focusing and prioritizing PSHE and RSE, zero tolerance stance on this issue of online or other forms of sexual violence. And for staff, the document offers recommendations on what to do if students encounter these issues, how you can support students, and options for both formal and informal reporting. Because again, going to the police isn't necessarily always the best option or what we would recommend. Okay, we also have another document that's a practical policy for senior leaders, and this includes a policy review checklist. So it explains the mechanisms, policies, or practices that either enable online sexual harassment or that prevent victims from reporting it. So again, this is a really consistent finding that young people who experience these sorts of practices, they don't tell anybody, or they certainly don't tell their parents, they don't tell their teachers, again, because they fear getting blamed. So we are, and the document argues that, again, this whole school joined up approach is needed, again, to tackle the issue of online sexual harassment and support victims. And again, it really focuses on why schools need RSE and PSHE to talk about these issues. It could be addressed through assemblies, it can be addressed multiple times throughout the school year, and why you need a well-trained staff who are, again, confident in addressing these issues. So this document argues that all staff need to have a baseline understanding of what online sexual harassment is, and they need to be aware of appropriate responses and curriculum approaches to it. So, this policy gives staff the knowledge for dealing with disclosures, and senior leaders, again, checklists on things that they can do to ensure that their school is prepared for tackling and handling these sorts of disclosures. We also have a short guidance for students, so it provides really easy to understand guidance for anyone who experiences forms of online sexual harassment. It's visualized through flowcharts. Again, it explains to them what online sexual harassment is, when it may be a criminal offense, information about their rights, and how they can safely and anonymously report these practices. And there is this kind of idea that once an image is out there, it's out there for good. And what we say to students is that that's not always the case. There are various mechanisms that can have images removed. It is becoming more difficult with end-to-end encrypted platforms like WhatsApp. But if something is posted on the internet, for example, it is very possible for these to be taken down. So in the past, we know that schools have had things like having students poster this sort of guidance. So in various classes, they can create posters, make this sort of guidance very aware for students, so that it's not just that staff know about it, it's that students understand these issues as well. Okay, so moving forward, thinking, because we're still in the middle of this research, we're still in the middle of creating resources, trying to find ways of supporting teachers, safeguarding leads, finding ways of supporting parents, finding ways of supporting young people. But what we say is that we're really committed to listening to the experiences of young people, teachers, parents, and school leaders. And we're interested in finding out what are their biggest issues, what solutions work and don't. And that's a lot of what we're doing at the moment. We've been in these 5 schools, and we're listening to young people, we're listening to teachers, we're trying to find out what works, what doesn't. But we think that we, as researchers, can't be the only ones that are having conversations and listening to the experiences of these various groups. We, especially young people's experiences, we need parents, we need governors, we need tech companies, we need lots of different people to join in with these kinds of conversations. The policies that we've created at the moment really focus on online sexual harassment, but we again recognize that there isn't always a clear distinction, that there is a blurring of boundaries, but we are also trying to develop these policies to make it much more explicit for schools to recognize sexual violence that's happening in the classroom or in the halls or on campus, or even kind of beyond the school grounds as well. We're also developing policies and resources for primary school students, teachers and parents, because we recognize that a lot of the issues that we're talking about, the practices that we're talking about, don't just start when students enter secondary school. A lot of these issues began as soon as young people began to get digital devices like mobile phones, which for many people can start 9 years old, 10 years old. So we know anecdotally that these sorts of practices are also happening at the primary level, and primary teachers, for example, and school leaders need ways of supporting staff and students. So one of the things that we are going to do is we're really investing in teacher training and working with schools to change the culture. So we recognize, like what we said before, that it's not enough just to have these RSE curriculum. We need staff who understand the fundamental issues that are causing, online sexual harassment. So over the next year, we have some funding where we are going to be rolling out teacher training. And maybe at the end of the presentation, my email and Tanya's email address is up, so you can send us an email if anyone's interested in having these free sessions. So they're not ready yet, but these are things that we're working on. And we're going to continue to push to make sure that RSE is recognized as an important part of the curriculum and as young people's holistic development. Okay, so I think this is really key and hopefully ties in nicely with what NAPCE does. So it's recognizing that, we need well-rounded young people who have understanding of healthy relationships, of consent, and we think that RSE plays a really crucial role here. So the pandemic, we know, has been very difficult on young people, especially young people. They've been experiencing higher rates of online sexual violence and harassment during these increased periods of isolation. And again, we believe that RSE is one important tool in young people's recovery. So I think that we will end it there. And I'll pass it back. Oh, no, I don't want to end the meeting. I'll try stopping it, and there we go.
Caitlin and Tanya, that was amazing. How you managed to get so much information into 30 minutes, I really don't know. Certainly from my point of view, I think it gave a real insight into the lives of young people in school today. And I think it probably, it makes you tend to make the assumption that schools are the same as when we went to school. You all sort of remember your school days, even if you're working as a teacher in schools, you sort of are guided by what happened when you were at school. And I think what your presentation's done is to really highlight how young people's lives and experiences are a million miles away from that, and how important it is that teachers do have that sort of insight and awareness of the reality of young people's lives, what their lives are like on a day-to-day basis. So thank you. That was just amazing, and thank you for the work that you're doing, and certainly from NAPCE's point of view. For 40 years, we've been supporting the idea that young people's personal development is an important part of their education. And if with the sort of rapidly changing modern world that you referred to in the presentation, that is more true than ever. We have to support the personal development of young people if we're going to do anything in terms of preparing them for the realities of what they're going to experience in their future lives. And certainly, Caitlin, I very much hope that we keep the partnership between yourselves and NAPCE, because we want to hear more about the excellent work that you're doing. And I think it's fantastic that you put out that offer of free training. Appreciate it's work in progress, but that I think is a fantastic offer, and NAPCE would certainly be interested in continuing to make people aware of the progress you're making and the issues you're coming across. Just we've got probably time for perhaps one or two questions while we've still got you with us. And the one I've had come in to me, which is perhaps quite topical, but try and get you off the fence a little bit. Might be a bit controversial, but the question I've had is, should mobile phones be banned in schools, or should young people be taught how to use them safely?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, we would argue that this abstinence approach, which is just banning the technology, isn't going to work, because young people will find ways around it. Maybe they're not doing things in school, but as soon as they leave the school grounds, they're going to go and do these things. So again, we believe the importance of teaching young people how to have healthy relationships. So how to treat other people with consent, to have respect. It's basic principles, because again, we also have to recognize that they're going to leave school at some point. So again, it's about preparing them to deal with the world that's out there, because these issues that we're talking about, they're not just affecting secondary school students. These are the sorts of experiences that they may have into their adult lives as they're forming these new relationships. So we would absolutely say, banning phones is not the answer. It's about teaching these broader principles of respect. Yeah. It's about making sure that there's accountability when these things happen. So it's not the person who's the victim who gets blamed, or at least all takes the bulk of the responsibility, that people who are doing things non-consensually need to be held accountable. Yeah.
I would just add to that, like, it's obviously, it's like, it's fine to have rules around mobile phone usage in school, and I totally understand that. I think there has to be rules around that, as long as that then, as long as there's not then an assumption that social media or phone is not an issue anymore. As Caitlin was saying, there still needs to be that education and discussion and awareness that whether you ban them or not, it's still going to be a part of school life.
Thank you both of you.
Yeah.
I've just had a question come in the chat. This is from Noel Purdy. Thank you for an excellent presentation. How important is it to educate younger children primary about these issues too? And what are the challenges faced in doing so in terms of getting schools and parents on board? I think you've sort of started to answer that question, but do you want to add any more specifically about younger children? Because I think there's still a sort of idea that children don't grow up until they're ready to leave school sometimes. And what would be your thoughts on that?
Yeah, we absolutely think that it's important to, we don't necessarily have to be talking about maybe dick pics with primary school children, but we need to be having the conversations about healthy relationships with young people from a very early age. And the relationship and education curriculum is doing that. So it is introducing these key concepts. You can introduce a concept like consent without it necessarily having this sexual connotation at a young age. So it can be things like, don't hug somebody without asking them, or just more broadly issues about consent. So we absolutely think that it is important to start having these conversations about kind of broader principles of relationships and consent from a young age. The issue of how you get schools and parents on board, we recognize is challenging, but we don't think that it's impossible. We think that it's important to have open dialogue. So to be, if a school is on board and wants to deliver, relationship and sex education that's consent-oriented, ethics-based, we think it is really important to have the conversations with the parents about, what sorts of things that young people are learning. We have worked with some schools that, faith-based schools, for example, which perhaps, parents may be slightly more concerned about having these kind of conversations. And they've told us that it's really just about keeping an open dialogue, keeping parents informed. So that is one issue. I suppose another issue is getting the schools on board in the first place. Again, it's for us, that's part of what we've been trying to do is we're gathering evidence to show schools that this, these instances of sexual violence, for example, and I guess I'm talking about secondary school, but I mean, my partner is a primary school teacher, and I know of instances of, nude image sharing in primary schools. So it isn't just a primary school issue, but yeah, getting the school leadership on board is really important, because you're never going to get that whole school cultural change unless the people at the top recognize these as issues. And that's part of what we're doing, is we're going out and we're gathering this empirical evidence, which hopefully we can use to help convince anybody who's not quite sure. I don't know, Tanya, if you want to jump in.
No, I just wanted to add that this is like a key cultural moment. Like there's been this Ofsted report, this Everyone's Invited website has really raised awareness. For us who've been doing research on this for a while, we're not shocked, and we don't quite understand why the government's shocked because they've been aware of this. But nonetheless, there is this moment now where schools are saying, oh my gosh, we really have to deal with this. We have to deal with it now. So there is a moment here, and I think a lot of schools are increasingly aware that they do need to address this. So I hope that that continues and that's taken seriously, and it's not just for the like to be seen to do it, but that it's being done in a meaningful, like long-term way.
Thank you very much. That links really well with the sort of theme of the conference, which is very much about, yeah, we've been through a pretty tough time for the last 18 months as a world, and certainly that's true for schools, for young people, and for children. But we can see this as perhaps an opportunity to reset education, to look at what is really important. And I think your talk this afternoon, your presentation, has really helped us really well along that road. So we could carry on talking for ages, and I know that lots of people are going to be very interested in following your work and supporting you in what you do. So once again, on behalf of NAPCE, can I thank Caitlin and can I thank you, Tanya, for being part of our conference. Thank you very much. I'm going to move to... Sorry.
Thank you so much, Phil.
Yeah.
Thank you, both of you.
No, thank you. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to move, because trying to be a good chair, and I'm not very often, but I'm going to try and keep us to time. And I'm going to move on to our second presentation this afternoon, which, again, I think links really, really well with the theme for the conference, and also for following on from our first presentation today. And the second conference is looking at how we promote social and emotional well-being. And I think our first presentation has put that in a really interesting context, that we need to be listening to young people. We need to understand from their point of view the world that they're living in before we try to perhaps tell them what schools can do for them. So I'm very pleased to welcome to the conference this afternoon Lee Pritchard, who's the head of the UK development for the Thrive approach, who NAPCE have worked with for a few years now, and they are one of the sponsors of our national awards for pastoral care and education. So I'm really pleased that the Thrive approach are part of the conference this afternoon. Lee's presentation is going to look at why it is that some people are able to bounce back really quickly when they get knocked back, and while other people find that it seems a little bit more like the end of the world. So she's going to be explaining more about resilience and why resilience is important. And just to say a little bit about Lee, she has over 20 years experience as a teacher with specific roles as a SENCO, leader for learning, and a foundation phase leader. Lee has also worked as a behaviour support coordinator for a local authority, and in 2014 Lee was part of the first cohort of Thrive licensed practitioners in Wales, achieving her Thrive trainee licence in 2016 prior to joining Thrive and helping them embed the Thrive approach in their settings. And I know that several of our member schools do use the Thrive approach. So Lee, a huge welcome to you this afternoon. I have already shared presentation with you, I think, so over to you.
Thanks, Phil. I'm just going to attempt to share my screen. My internet's been dropping in and out a couple of times through Caitlin and Tanya's presentation, so hopefully everybody stays with us. There is an interactive element, but possibly not going to use it because I don't want to test the internet connection too much. So I'll go through those slides. So hopefully you can see my slides on here, and I'll bring you back over so I can see you as well. Can you see that presentation? Can I just check? Is that okay? Yeah, lovely. Thank you very much. So welcome everybody. Thank you for joining me this afternoon and joining the conference with NAPCE, and it's lovely to be with all of you. I know that as Phil was talking and as Tanya and Caitlin were talking, I was just reflecting on the whole school approach element that they were talking about. It's certainly from our perspective at Thrive and the understanding that we draw from our underpinning theory that we use in our teaching, is certainly relevant for us, that we think and feel that the whole school approach to social emotional development, whether that's at primary or secondary, is absolutely vital from the leadership downwards really, and bottom up too, that we get this approach right for our children and young people. And I was also thinking about something that you said, Phil, which was this is a period of opportunity. And I think for us, we can focus on, and I've put it on this slide to start with, that the idea that we've been through this huge level of difficulty. Our children and young people have spent the last, 15 months, maybe slightly more, in and out of lockdown with these significant changes. But we have an opportunity to grasp this and do something differently, I think. And to use all of the available theory that we have and turn that into practice, so that we do our best for our children and young people at this time, and to build that level of resilience. And I think for me, certainly, when I think about resilience, I always go to the place of thinking about how we develop it. And when I think about that, we know that resilience develops when we overcome difficulty. And we've been through a period of time in this pandemic where overcoming difficulty has been something that we've had to do regularly. And if you've done that successfully, or done it well enough with the support around you, and our young people have had that support, hopefully, then they will have developed some resilience. It was fragile at best because of we've never been through this experience before, but hopefully that's starting to build. And if we can continue to support that and support the resilience developing, we'll absolutely know that we will build a generation or future generations that have that strength to deal with what life throws at them. And I think that's an important reflection as we start this discussion. I'm going to move on to the next slide. And in Thrive, we think about 3 levels of stress regulation. So if we've got a good, robust stress regulation system, when those difficulties are presented, when we face life's difficulties, we know that we've got the capacity to overcome it. And we might need support of others, we might need to lean on those closest to us, and we can still overcome that and bounce back. If we don't have a robust stress regulation system, you know, there will be a good proportion of children and young people that all of you are working with or know, and adults that you were alongside, that don't yet have a robust stress regulation system. So I'll talk a little bit about that and how we get it and link it to brain development as well for you. And the best way I've discovered, I think, for me to do this is to share a story about myself. And you can reflect on yourselves as well, and the children and young people that you work with, and what parts of your stress regulation system do you go to or utilise as I talk. So the story I'm going to tell is one of me when I was working in behaviour support and visiting lots of schools, and gone into a secondary school in the morning and taken some bags in with me. And I came out at lunchtime. I was rushing a little bit, needed to get to my next school in the afternoon, and I'd come out, got to my car and put my bags down, and a voice from up a little banking that was behind my car said, "Excuse me, miss, can you throw my ball back, please?" And doing my best to respond, I went up the banking, threw the ball over the fence. The grass was a little bit wet because it rained that morning, and I'm prone to be a little bit clumsy, and I slid down the banking and landed on the floor next to my car. This was my level of embarrassment was added to because I think it was year 10 or 11, we're on the AstroTurf opposite playing, doing sport at the same time. So as I lay on the floor, my first response was to take some breaths and just settle myself and try to breathe in the moment. And just as I did that, I felt that physiological response of going a little bit red and blushing. And I can almost feel it when I talk about that incident and when it happened. And so I was able to physiologically regulate myself, take a few breaths, steady myself, just check out through my body whether everything was okay. I felt fine. The next thing I did was reach my phone and ring. I rang my mum actually, just to let her know that I'd fallen over and to check in with somebody else. And what I had was what we would call relational regulation. So I was able to reach to somebody else knowing that support would be forthcoming. And once I checked in with my mum, I started to feel that regulation and return to my cognitive thinking and be able to think through what to do next. So I made a plan for myself. I was going to get in my car, put the heaters on, dry off any mud that was on my trousers, and brush it all off, and everything would be okay. I did do a bit of catastrophizing, which young people can often do, and us as adults, you know, I told my mum on the phone that I was covered in mud. That wasn't strictly true, but what I was able to do was draw on this stress regulation system. My stress regulation system is not perfect, and sometimes it doesn't work for me, but it's good enough and robust enough that it can get me out of most scrapes and difficulties. And we know that these layers of regulation that we can develop in terms of our stress begin right from, well, we would talk about the last trimester of pregnancy and those first 6 months of life. So you'll see that it's connected on my diagram to the brainstem. And actually, when we're born, that's the bit that is lit up and where we're functioning from. And when we're picked up and steadied and settled and rocked and calmed and soothed, we start to build the capacity for physiological regulation that can take us through life. In Thrive, we're a non-judgmental stance with parents. We just acknowledge that life throws stuff for all of us all of the time, a bit like COVID, and lots of the time we don't have any control over that. And generally, you know, we do the best that we can with the capacity that we have and the resources that we have in the moment. So what I know is that I had a good enough level of physiological regulation and restoration when I was at that age. So I'm now able to take a breath. I've worked on that, I think, as I've grown older and developed my self-awareness. And then I think about relational regulation. And absolutely, between the ages of about 6 to 18 months, when we're at toddler phase, when we start to move away from our adults and they respond to us, what we get a sense of is that adults are available to help us. And there may well be older children and young people in your settings that don't yet know that adults are available to offer that level of regulation, or that they can reach to them for that level of support. I'm holding in mind what Caitlin and Tanya were talking about, and actually our young people, some of them don't yet know that they can share that with adults, that they can go to them for support, so they don't have that to call on in their stress regulation system. And obviously at the top tier, when we get to about 18 months to 3 years, when we've had lots of adult support around us, we develop what we call cognitive regulation, that capacity to notice that we've got some feelings, to respond to that, to manage it, to keep thinking, being able to make sense of all of that, and at the same time make a plan or think about the consequences of actions and how we might get over the difficulty. And we call this the stress regulation system. And we know that this will have been massively tested through COVID, that some children will have, and young people will have had to call on this a lot, and the adults around them, to feel that level of regulation. Even more difficult and more compromised by the fact that relationship has often been denied us. And we know that we have relationships taken away from us and replaced by this online world that we find ourselves in, and the connection can sometimes not be the same, or it can be lost connection, and that impacts on those feel-good chemicals when we lose that connection. So if we were robust enough in the first place, it'll have been a bit of a tricky time, and with support we might have been able to, or we will have been able to, overcome the difficulty. If we've not had a good enough development prior to lockdown, or prior to difficulties or life throwing some stuff at us, we know that it's going to be more difficult to overcome what's happening. So that resilience becomes critical. And I think it's really high on the agenda at the moment, because our children and young people are returning into school settings. Some of the bubbles are absolutely bursting at the moment in school settings, and children going back out, or young people back out into lockdown again and away from school and isolation. And having that capacity to overcome that difficulty in that repeated way, it's really testing the stress regulation system, and probably testing the stress regulation system of all of the adults around young people at the moment, because they're in a position of offering that support. So real food for thought, I think, when we think about this stress regulation system and how we can build it. And we talk about providing, and really interesting to hear Caitlin and Tanya talk about relationship, and Phil talking about relationships as well, because we know that providing those appropriate adult relationships can absolutely strengthen this stress regulation system. So in Thrive, we talk about this positive message that if we provide the right sort of relationships and the right sort of experiences, we can really strengthen this and build new neuronal pathways and new learning for our children and young people, and for ourselves as we deepen our self-awareness too. We link this in Thrive to the triune brain, a model from the 1950s from Paul MacLean. So it's a very simplified version of the triune brain, but it's enough for us to be able to understand what's happening. So as I said, when I introduced the stress regulation system, we connect this to the instinctual brain, or the brain stem, where the brain and the body are connected together. And also where our newborn is functioning from, all about that survival really, in terms of hunger and sleep and temperature control and that breathing and all of those basic needs that we have. And through the relationships and the way that we're met in relationship, we start to build connections through the neuronal pathways up through the brain. So up into that limbic system, where we see the seat of the emotions, where we start to be able to read those, we have those sensory experiences, where that level of curiosity about the world sits. And as that brain develops and those neuronal pathways and connections grow, we reach out into the cortex. And we know that our neuronal pathways and our brain development is broadly bottom up and right to left for about the first 2 years of life. And then those connections go in all sorts of directions. And I think really significant for our older students, I'll start at 3 first. So we have a massive synaptic pruning at age 3. So we know that anything that the child hasn't used up until that point is pruned away. And the reason that that happens is that we can develop more complex pathways in our brains as we develop for the ongoing development. So we have an opportunity in our school and in our education system to provide those relationships and experiences so that we can build new neuronal pathways. And that's not the only period of pruning that happens in the brain. The next one is in early adolescence. So often adolescence, I think, gets a very negative press. And our teenagers are often called challenging and difficult. I would challenge you, I think, to see if you can shift the language with adults that you work with, and instead of thinking about challenging behaviour, start to think about distressed behaviour. Because we think about behaviour as communication, and if we're seeing behaviour coming out to this that might be what we call challenging, actually what's underneath that is that level of distress that the individual is experiencing. And they use the strategies and that they've developed, or because of the way that they've been responded to. Often for our children and young people, they are triggered, and we know that in the limbic system, our amygdala is scanning like that meerkat for potential threat. I'll come back to that in a second, and can get us up and out of the difficulty, or hide us, or make us hide away. We have no choice or control over that. So our behavior isn't a choice. It's not until we've got a level of thinking around it that we can make those choices. So we will have young people who are being triggered all of the time because they're wired by their past experiences and they're in a state of difficulty. And even more complex in adolescence, because of this synaptic pruning, we see our teenagers reverting back from the cortex to functioning from the seat of the emotions in the limbic system. So it's no surprise then that our teenagers have a heightened sense of emotion and respond in an emotional way. And I was writing some things down as Caitlin and Tanya were talking. You know, we know that in adolescence the dopamine level drops, so there's a greater stimulation needed to release that dopamine. So sometimes we see that risk-taking behavior. A normal part of adolescence is to see that increase. However, it can tip into inappropriate behaviors when we don't have the adult support around us, or we don't yet have a good enough sense of our stress regulation system and what's happening for us, and a good enough level of cognition and thinking. So we can see that impact on our teenagers. We talk about a window of opportunity because given the right experiences and right relationships, it's a really key time to rewire and to redo that learning and to develop those neuronal pathways. So could we shift our adolescent focus from this negative understanding that we have into this is a really positive opportunity? And if you're not familiar with the work of Dan Siegel, I'm sure you are. He talks about this positive lens that we can view adolescence through as children and develop into young people, that we can provide these opportunities, these relationships and experiences, and support them to develop the resilience, support them to develop the skills that they need to navigate the world that Caitlin and Tanya were talking about. So absolutely real fruitful development that we can do, which is why I think coming out of this pandemic, as I started talking at the beginning, we absolutely can do something to support our children and young people to be resilient and to overcome the difficulties that are ahead of us. So I'm just gonna click on. So you might be familiar with neuroception and the amygdala. So this idea of the meerkat picking up on this perceived threat that's out there. And if we've had past experiences that are difficult or distressing or have left us much more vulnerable, this amygdala can be triggered very regularly, almost on a daily, or for some children and young people, they are hypervigilant and checking out where that threat is coming from all of the time. And calming and soothing that, so providing that relationship and those relational experiences so that they can settle and feel calmed and soothed in their settings, is really important. And this comes from the work of Stephen Porges, and he talks about this idea of neuroception. And I'm sure you're familiar with fight, flight and freeze, maybe less so around the social engagement system. So Porges talks about this autonomic nervous system, that we've got this environment outside the body and the one inside the body. The nervous system checking out what's going on, and this meerkat of the amygdala system scanning for that potential threat to get us up and out of the difficulty. And if our amygdala perceives that there's a level of danger, it will take us into fight or flight. If there's much bigger threat out there, possibly a pandemic, life threat, it can take us into the freeze response. And in the work that we've been doing across all of our training with our licensed practitioners in larger audience delivery, we absolutely know that there's an increase in this freeze type behaviour. So seeing that shutdown, that withdrawal, and there's a whole spectrum of behaviour that sits in the freeze response. So you may well see children and young people retreating to their safe places. Lots of reports of children and young people withdrawing at home and into their bedroom, school refusal increasing because of it. So we see this happening for our children and young people on the increase and being reported to us. If we perceive the level of safety out in the world, we can check people's faces for that level of safety. And Porge talks about this area of facial expression, the eyes and round up to the top of the mouth, being really key for checking out somebody's facial expression and determining whether we feel safe or not. So we see these opportunities when we feel safe in the world, and our bodies feel safe and settled, and we can determine that level of safety, absolutely knowing that we can feel at rest, at ease, able, and Porge talks about being able to rest, digest and connect. So up for connection with others, so being able to engage in learning. So navigating this and working out what's happening for our children and young people becomes critical in developing this stress regulation system. What is it that they need from the adults around them to support them with that, to make develop a more robust stress regulation system? And then this concept, I think it takes that a slightly step further. If you're familiar with the work of Pat Ogden, and she talks about this window of tolerance. And we have this window of tolerance. I think I've probably got quite a robust window of tolerance. You know, when I was sitting waiting for Caitlin and Tanya to finish speaking, I could feel my hands go a little bit clammy as Phil was getting ready to pass to me. I could feel some butterflies in my tummy. I could take a breath. I could take a drink, I could settle myself, and I could start talking about the subject that I'm deeply passionate about, I think, and I hope that's come across. But we also know that we fluctuate. So there will be times when I'm much closer to hypoarousal or hypoarousal. So as I fluctuate during the day, you know, if things become a bit stressful, I get pushed to the edge of my window of tolerance, and hopefully my robust stress regulation system can bring me back well within that window. But for some of the adults that we work with, for some of the children and young people, they will be tipped out of this window of tolerance, and they'll need support to be able to get back within it. So some things to think about as we move, as I get towards the end of my time slot. Beneath every behaviour is a feeling. You know, we have these feelings in our bodies, and for some children and young people, it can be really difficult to make sense of what's happening for them, or to understand what those feelings are. They may need support, and they might need some adult help to understand that. But underneath every feeling is a need, whether that's need for connection or need to feel safe. And we know that safety underpins everything that comes after it. So understanding that, we can see the behaviour on the screen, but actually sitting under that is a feeling and probably a need under that. Instead of meeting the behaviour, if we can shift our focus to meet what's underneath it, the behaviour can stop happening. So the need, it can dissipate because actually I've got my needs met. So standing in that place of curiosity, being able to imagine into the emotional landscape of the child or young person that we're working with becomes really crucial, because that's when we can start to think about what is happening here. When a young person tips the table and leaves the classroom, I'm wondering what that's about. You know, is it that they're scared? Is it that they've had a level of shame about that subject? Is there something going on for them that means that they can't engage, and the only strategy they've got available to them is to tip the table and leave? And we talk about those as survival strategies. And how do we get underneath that, or how do we help our colleagues to understand that that's, there's little choice over that for the individual. Actually, what they're doing is surviving in the only way that they have available to them in the moment. And then just to draw this to a close, some ways to think about how we can support children and young people. So I think the top one is really key. Self-regulation comes before co-regulation. As adults in education, we absolutely have to be or work on our self-regulation so that we can be alongside our children and young people and deliver that co-regulation that they might need. My top tip, if you like, is to validate the feelings of everybody. So saying to somebody, do you know, it's really tough and hard when you have to come into school and you didn't want to come this morning, or something's happened on the way in, and I'm so sorry that's difficult for you. So we validate it, and we talk in Thrive about being tough on the behaviour, but gentle on the child or the young person. So we get it. It's never okay to do some of the things that our children and young people do, and we understand how that's happened and how can we help so that it doesn't happen again. And bringing containment to it. So predictability and routine kind of went out of the window at the beginning of the pandemic. And I think everybody might have been a little bit excited about the novelty of there being no traffic or people at home. And I think that went rapidly as time went on. So providing that containment, routine and structure sounds simple, but will absolutely support our children and young people to feel better and to feel more settled. And use of creativity in the arts and play. Through the research and that's out there, we know that neuronal pathways in the brain grow at a much quicker rate when they're done through art and play and creativity. So absolutely essential that we provide those opportunities for our young people. So I'm going to draw it to a close there. So hopefully I've done that on, and no, I don't want to leave the meeting either. I want to stop sharing my screen. I just spotted where Caitlin was with her presentation, then trying to stop it. So thank you everybody for your time and for listening.
Thank you very, very much, Lee. Thank you. That was a really positive and motivating presentation, and thank you for being so open and sharing your experience of falling over. It did remind me of one experience when I was ahead of year and I was doing the assembly. You'll know the one. It's where you've let yourselves down, you've let your school down, you've let your family down, and I was really into it, going ever so well, when suddenly I fell off the stage. And it was greeted by absolute silence, apart from giggles down the one side, which is where the staff were all sat. Without a word of a lie, the whole of the young people, not one of them laughed until they realised that I was actually laughing. And my main concern was how I was going to get back up on the stage and then go back. And I told you so. So I thank you very much for sharing that with us. I think we've just probably got time very quickly for one question, and we're getting questions in the chat, and if we don't cover all of them this afternoon, we'll try and bring them into question time tomorrow night. So please, everybody, come along to question time if we've not managed to answer your questions this afternoon. But listening to your presentation, we've heard a lot about sort of all the negative impact of the pandemic. There's been lots of research about, the negative impact that it's had on children and young people. And yet sort of a thought came across to me while we were talking that is there a positive dimension to that as well? In other words, can the pandemic be a positive impact, influence, experience for children and young people?
Well, I think certainly it'll depend on the experience that people have had going through it, and certainly for some children and young people, and I know I've spoken to practitioners and parents and some of my colleagues, that some children and young people were quite happy to be at home. It was an opportunity to to be close to their family that they hadn't had before, and then going back to school, finding that really difficult. And, you know, I'm a parent, and my 15-year-old suddenly had mum home every night when I'd been on the road for work or away, and that can be really connecting for an individual when that has been denied them. So I know that there would have been young children and teenagers who would have found it really hard going back to school and being away from the adults that they'd had that close connection with. So that was a positive outcome for lots of children and young people. You know, when I was driving my daughter back on that first morning, I remember it vividly, and the nerves that she was feeling, seeing the adult facial expressions where they all stood with their clipboards, being ready to receive these young people as they came into the settings, and with the best of intentions. Actually, what they communicated was, I'm really nervous about this, and the young people picking up on it. But yeah, I think there is a positive outcome from it, and we have an opportunity now, don't we? I think to be able to build resilience. We can grasp this now and say, okay, so what is it our children and young people need, so that if stuff happens again, we don't send them into this spin they can actually cope with, and they've got the strategies, the coping strategies to get past the difficulties that life throws at them.
And it would be nice to think that that's going to be given the priority it deserves.
Hope so.
Yeah, and that perhaps also the experience we've had as adults, where we felt uncertain about the future, not too sure about what's going to happen, will help us have a little bit more empathy with young people and be able to build on that in our future work with them.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right when you use the word empathy. I think when I talk about validating a child or young person's experience, or a colleague, I think if we can sit in that position of compassion and empathy and start talking and using that language with our colleagues, we can absolutely start to imagine into what it might be like for our children and young people, and then respond from that place. And I think that's key to developing those relationships.
Thank you very much, Lee. Can I thank you on behalf of NAPCE for your contribution to the conference, and also can I thank the Thrive approach for your partnership with NAPCE. And I think there's a lot of similarities between how our members see the way learning and education should be and the approach that the Thrive approach has. So thank you very much for that. Thank you.
Thank you. It's been lovely to be with you.
Now, trying to be a good chair, I'm doing probably better than usual actually at keeping to time. So that links really well with moving to our next speaker. And I'm very pleased to welcome Connor Acton, who should already have presenter mode. So as long as that's worked, Connor, you should be ready to go. Connor is going to talk about, as it says on screen there, pastoral care post-COVID, which links really well with what we've been talking about on the first day of the conference today, the idea that the experience that we've all had in the last 18 months can be a springboard for a better experience for young people in schools in the future. Connor is a pastoral leader and a teacher in a Leicester secondary school. He's held a variety of roles linked to pastoral care, including head of year, assistant head of year, and mentor in a variety of disadvantaged contexts. Connor is chair of trustees at Brookvale Groby Learning Campus, chair of trustees for the RSPCA in Leicestershire, and he is also, I'm very pleased to say, a member of the National Executive Board for NAPCE. Welcome to Connor.
Thanks, Phil. Thank you for everybody that's here as well. So as Phil said, when he sort of gave me the opportunity to present today, it really felt like a real chance to offer a reflective opportunity, really, and think about the fact that we've been through this and still are in the midst of this very challenging, very difficult experience that everybody has now been through, and a real shared understanding and a real sort of shared pain in a lot of senses that gives us a sort of springboard to jump from. So the opportunity to really be thinking about, you know, what does pastoral care after a COVID world look like was one that I just felt was too good to turn down. Phil sort of introduced me there, and very, very aptly sort of put together my experience in schools, and I think it's just important that I share that, you know, so that you know who's talking to you. My experience is fairly varied across, as Phil said there, 4 quite disadvantaged schools, and I moved to a new school at the start of this year as well. So actually I was at a school in the previous lockdown, and then moved to a new school during the lockdown as well. So it's been a real interesting experience seeing how one school responded to COVID, and then seeing how another school responded to COVID, and being part of that sort of catch-up process. And largely what I'm going to talk about today are some of my anecdotal reflections, really, on how we've sort of managed that process, but also the information that I've gleaned from colleagues, from other local schools that I've been working closely with, and then sort of the wider online networks that are obviously available to all of us now. So the elephant in the room is clearly COVID, and one of the things that concerned me the most was, how do we take this terribly negative thing and ensure that actually pastoral care becomes something more afterwards? You know, the theme of this conference is, does every child still matter? And I'm going to talk about sort of my reflections and feelings on that at the end. But actually, where does this take us? You know, what is the feeling of everybody in schools about what the next steps are for pastoral care, given this sort of scenario that we all find ourselves in? And I thought the best place to start actually would be to sort of just look at the Ofsted framework. Obviously changed in recent years. There was a new EIF that came out, and there's a real discussion going on at the moment about sort of whether that framework is going to be appropriate in a post-COVID world. But actually that discussion focuses largely on the section to the left of this table, which is the curriculum, teaching and learning side of things, rather than the typically pastoral concerns that you can see that I've highlighted on the right there. So in reality, we probably do need to have a discussion about, you know, whether being judged on our attitudes to learning, behaviour, respect, attendance, and all of those sort of range of things that impact pastoral care, whether there is going to be an impact on us, whether we can be judged in the same way that we were before the pandemic, and also whether there are lessons to be learned within that. So I tried to just sort of break that down into, you know, what are those sort of key areas. If I go back it actually a second before I start that, although it won't let me press that button. There we go. There are a couple of things that I've just stripped out. So actually all of the behaviour and attitudes elements, the personal development elements, and then a couple of leadership and management elements, I think, are the crucial sections that relate to pastoral care. And what I want to do is just sort of talk about my own reflections on my own school and how this has worked, but also encourage anybody that's listening to sort of think yourselves about what's this looked like in your school or your trust, you know, and whether it matches my anecdotal experience and the anecdotal experience of other schools. Interestingly for us, attitudes to learning, we've seen a massive increase. We've seen that actually students have come back from the lockdown, students have been so motivated to learn, they've really picked up the ball and run with it. We hope as a result of recognizing just how difficult it is to do school if you're not at school. But actually, I walk around lessons in my school at the moment, and they are purposeful, they are driven, more so than perhaps before we had the lockdown. You know, so is there a lesson to be learned about how we frame what we do? Because we talked a lot before they came back about the importance, sort of through virtual assemblies and things like that, of coming back with the right ethos, the right drive to learn, without talking about sort of missed learning and lost opportunities. And they came back and they've really just absolutely almost shocked us, you know, with just how driven and aware they are of the fact that they need to be on it really, really quickly. So for us, we've sort of reflected on our messaging. You know, what do we say to our students to ensure that actually our classrooms are as purposeful and driven as they can be? And is our messaging clear that, you know, we didn't want to say anything about lost learning, and that's helped us? So is there something that we lose in normal years do we need to talk to our students differently and clarify our expectations differently? Because now we've got this shared experience and understanding, they understand, we understand the same thing. Has that helped us? And I think that's the important part of that reflection for me, is everybody's gone through the same experience, students and staff. There's usually this dissonance between students and staff of, well, I've done it. I've been to school, I've done my GCSEs. I don't need to do this again. Because we've all been through this shared experience of the pandemic and we understand the loss almost, we've communicated that really well with the students, and everybody starts from the same point. So that was our reflection on how we improved our attitudes to learning. Behaviour for us is I put sort of a middling reflection. We've seen a real rise in behaviour issues around social interaction and communication. Students who haven't been able to regulate themselves. Listening to Lee was really interesting, because actually we found that our students have struggled to resolve problems with each other that they would have normally been able to resolve through speaking to each other. The incidents have sort of turned and become quite problematic really quickly, because students don't seem to have the ability to calm themselves down and cool themselves down and take that breath. Rather, it's the big reaction that comes from it, and it comes much faster. What we have seen, though, is an improvement in behaviour in lessons that links to our attitude to learning. But that, again, is in a very controlled environment. So our reflection there is, how do we ensure that our students have got those social interaction and communication skills to be able to manage and regulate their own behaviour? And are we sure that our staff understand how to develop those skills in our students? Because that's the sort of link there, and the big missing section for me is, you know, do our staff know how to calm a situation with a student before it arises? Can they spot an issue before it's coming up, or are they reactive? And that's an area that we're going to be working really heavily on, because we feel that ultimately our staff at the moment can't see some of those situations arising. How do we develop that in our staff through our training? And that's something that I'll talk about later on. Attendance, really obvious. Attendance has gone down for us, as it will have done in most schools. Our job for next year is going to be really clearly thinking about how we manage some of those students that Lee talked about there, our school refusers, for example, who have continued to refuse school, but some of our sort of systems and procedures that have been impacted due to COVID, how are we going to ensure that we pick them up and push them forward is a question that's sort of looming heavy on my mind. Health and wellbeing in our community has gone down dramatically. Anecdotally, again, we've had more school nurse referrals than I can remember in recent memory. We've had more issues with self-harm than I can even compare to any recent years. Mental health and wellbeing significantly on the rise, issues related to that. The issues that have come from the pandemic in terms of disadvantage, job losses, parents struggling to feed their children in some cases, the health and wellbeing issues that have come from that have jumped significantly for us in a very disadvantaged community. The amount of students that we have to go above and beyond in terms of feeding at the moment, where an FSM student isn't getting fed enough through their free school meals, and we're having to provide breakfast and something for them to take home, has risen dramatically. But actually, you know, it's a situation where we can't ignore that. And so how do we manage that for next year? Preparations for the next stage has taken a real hit for us. Our year 11s didn't manage to get a full suite of careers interviews, for example. And so that is something that when we reflect on it, we think about, well, if they're not getting the right preparation for their next stage, when they get to that next stage, are we going to have more issues in pastoral care because students aren't moving to the right destinations? So that's something we think we need to be really aware of. We're conscious that sort of vision and ethos in schools has taken a hit. This year has been a really reactive one. You know, I know, for example, the school at which I'm a chair of trustees, they have very much decided this year that it's one for holding. It's a holding pattern, not one for making big changes, which is absolutely sensible. But that means that as a consequence, you know, some of those things that we've talked about in terms of development and strategy just haven't happened. Now there'll be a lag on that. You know, how do we ensure that we're not falling behind on things that absolutely we recognise needed to take place pre-pandemic? And that then links to workload and well-being of staff. We've got a real issue at the moment, I feel, with staff who are absolutely crawling to the end of this term, who are going to have a very sort of unusual holiday period with, you know, not the normal sort of holidays abroad and relaxing periods, because there'll be information about tags and all of the range of things that are just going to be occupying teachers' heads this summer and support staff, etc. We may have a situation where our pastoral staff are burned out before we even start next year. Again, a huge thing for us to be reflecting on. Exclusions for us have gone up. I would imagine the picture is quite similar in sort of the national context. I'll be very interested to see that data when it comes out. But again, it's linked to lots of those issues that I talked about before of social interaction and communication. You know, our exclusions may well be sort of higher than previous years, but is very much concentrated in one area. Governance, for me as a school governor, I've not been as involved as I could be in terms of pastoral care this year when it comes to governance of that. We haven't been able to see the things that we want to see, been able to perform the checks and the monitoring visits that we want. And so again, there have been things that have lagged and suffered as a result, and governance is going to have to pick up that slack next year. But I thought I'd end on a positive. As far as I'm concerned, safeguarding in schools is probably in the best place it's ever been, because there have been so many more focuses on welfare, checking in on students while they've been at home in lockdown periods, the opportunity to engage with parents, and I think there are some real lessons to learn on safeguarding that, again, I'll talk about later. So a picture of lots of red arrows on that screen in my anecdotal experience of sort of my schools and the schools that I'm working with. And that for me is important to acknowledge, because it talks about the platform of where we go to next. So really, to summarize that, I believe that we've got a real issue at the moment with social communication and interaction, certainly within my locality. It would be interesting to see if that's the common reflection, if the same issues that we're facing are the issues that others are facing. A real rise in mental health and well-being issues, disadvantage on the increase. If you're already working in a disadvantaged context, I'm sure that you will have seen that actually this is going to cause us a problem long term. You know, support services have been stripped back over time, and we find ourselves in a position where that is only going to get worse, I fear. To ignore the academic and attainment gaps would be, again, fairly foolish, I think. It's going to be a problem for us that there are students who have missed significant chunks of school, and the impact that that will have on pastoral care and on behaviour as a knock-on is going to be significant. You know, students who have missed lessons, we know even students who miss a couple of lessons in a week and then come back into school, for some that will create a rise in behaviour issues because they can't engage with the work, they've missed something, and so they struggle to regulate their behaviour as a result in some cases. That's going to be the case, but on a significant scale. So again, something to be really aware of from a pastoral perspective. We can't rule that out as something that's going to influence us. And then the final part of that is a summary of sort of parental attitude and frustration, I think. You know, we're at a point where I think there will be have been a lot of people cheering about the announcement on bubbles, and the fact that next year is going to be slightly different when it comes to COVID. But there is a lot of parental concern, frustration and fatigue about what's happened this year, the past year and a half, I should say. And for us to balance that as schools and ensure that actually we've got our community on board is going to be and will continue to be a big challenge. But it's not all doom and gloom. And this is the important part. So one of the things that has been my biggest bugbear throughout my education career, I started working in schools when I was 17. And I remember sitting in my first inset as a member of staff where the head teacher at the time spoke about love and love for the students in the school, and the fact that the school was a school where students came in and they were loved by staff. And I remember sitting there at the time and scoffing and sort of going, no, what are you talking about? This is nonsense. Children don't come to school to be loved. They come to school to get an education. It took probably 2 months of working in that really disadvantaged environment to go, okay, I understand. I get it. They need love. And within that time, I met a young man who was a year 7, started the same time as I did. He would come to school every day, having not had breakfast. the only meal that he would get would be the meal provided by school. But he was the kind of boy who'd buy a couple of drinks and a pizza at break time with his FSM money, and then have nothing for lunch, and then he'd have nothing for dinner. And for me, from the very beginning of my career, like I said, one of the huge things for me has been making sure that actually the students in our care are fed appropriately. You know, how can you concentrate at school if you are hungry? And so one of the huge positives that came out of this pandemic for me was the focus on holiday hunger, free school meals, and actually the impact that that had on driving forward that message. And that for me is one thing that I think we just can't drop. You know, as pastoral staff, we need to ensure that that message continues to be pushed, and that we make sure that there are not children in this country going hungry at school or during the holidays. But what a hugely successful thing that came from the pandemic that was. The second thing for me in terms of great successes is the collaboration that's come out of the sector. For me, I think we are talking more than we ever have about pastoral care. I think there are more people engaged with pastoral care in schools than ever before. And what a wonderful thing that is, that we are having so many discussions, not just about education and schooling, but about the fact that actually care and sort of what I said there about love and support is at the forefront for children. You know, it's a wonderful thing that everybody is sort of coming together and really, really clear that we need to ensure that actually our environments are the best they can be for schools, for children, sorry, in schools. Some of it is a knock-on of the fact of, like I said, those public services being stripped back, and schools becoming a bit of a catch-all and sort of taking on a big responsibility when it comes to community impact. However, the more that we do, the more it becomes obvious what we do. And so the more support we should get, the more we need to talk about that. We need to be as good as we possibly can be, I think, about engaging with everybody within the network of pastoral care in schools and ensuring that we shout from the rooftops the work that we do with our students. And I think that's the thing that became really clear through the pandemic to people, to parents, and to other providers, is just how much work schools do. It's not just about coming to school and doing 5 lessons a day. So much of what happens in a child's life comes from their school. And then sort of that leads into the increased focus on pastoral care. You know, when I started in pastoral care in, I think it must have been about 2013, there was a real lack of reading material. That was something that bothered me at the time, was actually how do I get ahead? How do I pick up sort of strategies and tools? And I remember somebody saying to me really clearly, well, you don't, you just do the job. You know, you do the job, you learn it, and then you pick up all of these things. And it was sort of like, oh, but surely there's a faster way. Surely I can pick up some hints and tips and tricks. But actually what we've found is that now as a sector, I think we are increasing the view on us sort of as professionals, and ensuring that actually we are sharing best practice, whether that's online through social media, whether it's through the rise in sort of books that are coming out, or whether it's just things like this conference today, you know, where people are sitting around and talking about pastoral care and how we get the absolute best out of this system. So for me, that's a really exciting thing that will hopefully continue to push. So what do we take forward? What are the successes of this pandemic? So I asked this question on Twitter and got some responses from people. And I'll sort of summarize these in a second into key areas really. But keeping year groups in zones at social times, so a little bit of sort of management of students within school. Again, keeping social zones, staggered access, tutor group zones, online parent meetings. You know, this comes back to sort of systems and what works and what will we pick up and take forward. Weekly CPD, one of the things that you know tends to be criticised when it comes to pastoral care. I think the schools that do this the best are schools that find opportunities for pastoral CPD for staff. It's very often forgotten within the world of teaching and curriculum, that actually we train our staff on pastoral care, because everybody in school is a pastoral leader as far as I'm concerned. You know, whether you're a cleaner, whether you're a teaching assistant, whether you're a mentor, whether you're a teacher, you have a pastoral role in your school. And so actually we should be pushing CPD when it comes to pastoral care for everybody in the building. Again, another one about where we keep our children. This is one that sort of I thought was a really sort of sensible idea, is actually making opportunities available for students to have one-to-ones or conversations via video, or filling in Google forms, you know, picking up those opportunities where they've gained these skills through the pandemic to access things online, to ensure that actually they can access support in different ways. You know, there are lots of students who will struggle with a face-to-face meeting. We know that. So why would we not continue with varied methods for them to access support? Again, that links to an increase in online support and groups. Linking back to the safeguarding comment that I made, forcing schools to increase the number of welfare calls that they make. I know that I, as a pastoral leader throughout this pandemic period, we rang parents 3 separate times, every parent in every year group throughout this year. What a wonderful opportunity that was to just talk through how people were feeling, and the gratefulness and the gratitude from those people all the way through that period was something that we just thought, you know, if we could do this more often and we maintain it through the, you know, after the pandemic, we'd be foolish not to. Again, another one about keeping year groups together. So we're seeing that there's a picture of people sort of thinking about systems and routine and structure. Lineups, so how we bring children into buildings, grouping of corridors, etc. And then another one about CPD and training. So, you know, are we sure that actually everybody's got the skills that they need? That summarized is basically still having high expectation. You know, the pandemic has changed nothing. We should have the highest expectations for our children. The way that people seem to have figured out, you know, the best way to do that, I should say, is through structure and routine. Children need structure and routine more than ever coming out of this pandemic. We've always known that children need structure and routine, but we really, really need it now. And the reflection is that the more of that we do, the better children have coped this year. Continuing to push parental partnerships, doing everything that we can to ensure parents are working with us and we're working with parents. Maintaining high safeguarding standards and not losing the contact that we've made this year. Streamlining systems where possible. Are there things that we've done in the past just because we've always done them that we haven't done this year because we haven't been able to? We need to reflect on those. Do we cut some of the fat? Training in CPD, I talked about, making sure that all staff in schools are trained as pastoral leaders. And then continuing our outreach and collaboration, making sure that we don't focus on ourselves, that we're not inward looking, but as outward facing as we possibly can be. And so finally, I believe I've got about 4 minutes left. I thought it would be a good opportunity just to sort of pose some questions for you to sort of ask yourselves as pastoral staff within schools. What have you learned about your school and pastoral systems throughout this pandemic? What are the things that you will take forward? What will you drop? Are they the same kind of things that I've spoken about today and that other people have reflected on? This is a really big one for me. How's your community been affected or impacted by COVID? You know, what's the local situation when it comes to jobs? What's the local situation when it comes to access to food banks? You know, are you aware of the context that you're working in and how that's impacting the children that walk through your doors every day? What are the challenges that we might face next year that we haven't potentially thought about? You know, is there going to be a knock-on impact of some of the announcements that were made earlier in this week? Have we made changes this year that we're keeping around? Do we need to look at our policies and update those? A big one for me, again, is I think when it comes to pastoral care in schools, we often sort of just keep it as it is all the time. You know, you've got 5 heads of year or 5 heads of house, a mentor and this, but are we being contextually driven? You know, do we have a mentor that's focusing on the context and the challenges that we're facing at this point in time? Do we need to look at how our staffing structure meets the absolute needs of our community? What are the things that have suffered this year? Is there anything that we can do to compensate for that? Similar to the community one, how have outside agencies been impacted? I sat and spoke to a social worker this week who basically said that she was on the verge of quitting. She'd never been in anything like it. The amount of referrals coming through, the referrals that were coming through and the severity of them, and basically said she'd been in social services for 25 years and she was going to call it quits this year. You know, is there going to be an impact on the external agencies that we work with that are already incredibly stretched? Training I've talked about. How do we ensure that our staff come back not burned out? And again, you know, that we've made it adequate opportunity for things like supervision and staff care. And then what are we doing in terms of looking at the future of our pastoral systems and the needs of the school? So finally, the question at the start of this sort of conference was, does every child still matter? And I think the answer is absolutely yes, more than ever. We're in a situation where there are going to be lots and lots of children struggling, and there already are lots and lots of children struggling. Every child still matters, and we need to make sure that our pastoral systems support them as we move out of this pandemic. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Connor. And I think you really illustrated really well the response to the question, does every child still matter? That probably more than ever, which is very much what the conference is about and what the conference is addressing. Thank you for sharing your experiences and perhaps just as important or more important, your reflections on those experiences. And I've got several comments in the chat about very encouraging talk, great talk, thank you. Thanks, Connor, really motivating presentation. A comment, you've hit the nail on the head in so many ways. Thank you, really useful and giving me lots to think about. And a question just come in on the chat, Connor. Is it possible to have a peer post-COVID counselling group in schools? I think the government and some schools think that the way to move forward is to throw more work at students, but they need more help to cope with the incredible changes that we've all had to deal with. Any thoughts on that, Connor?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I mean, one of the conversations that I've been having this week in our context is that actually I want to make sure that we've got more sort of therapeutic responses available within our school. So, you know, we do things like forest schools, we do things like art therapy. You know, we're secondary, so actually there's less opportunities for that than I would like. But actually there's a recognition that these students need support. They need opportunities to decompress in a lot of situations, you know, and I want to make sure that there are lots and lots of opportunities for sort of group mentoring, counselling, but also, you know, just time to be in school, but not in lessons. You know, there are students who just need to be in, around role models, having discussions about what's sort of going well for them and what's not. So I think, yeah, it's absolutely about sort of making sure that, you know, I think the job that we've done this year as schools and pastoral staff is absolutely phenomenal, but we need to be clear that there is going to be more work to do next year, you know, and I think ensuring that actually we've got the systems in place to do that is going to be a challenge, but it's going to be about doing all of those things that were listed in that question, you know, working together, bringing people together and bringing students together. That's one of the things that we haven't been able to do this year in terms of peer-to-peer stuff, bubbles crossing. You know, there is a massive opportunity, I think, to bring this sector forward and do much, much more. So, yeah, I think lots of opportunity.
Thank you, Connor. I noted down your comments about challenges next year, and I think one of the biggest challenges this year is, and the previous year was, we just never knew what was coming next, and I'm not too sure we're any clearer now, really, but perhaps it'll look better afterwards. Another question I've got just time to ask, I think, Connor, is you talked about attitude to learning improving, and that's very positive. But I guess the question is, how do we sustain that improvement?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting one. You know, and sort of what I was trying to capture in that conversation was, you know, we were very clear throughout our process of bringing students back that it wasn't about catching up. It wasn't about filling gaps, like I said. It was very much about bringing them back to school and making sure that they were in an environment where they almost understood the purpose of school. And I think that's something that's really benefited us when it comes to those attitudes to learning is everybody being really clear why we're here, what we're doing, and not sort of saying, okay, you're here just for the academic performance, but really that whole, you know, community-driven feeling, I guess. And so, yeah, it's about how you frame it, I think, when it comes to those improving attitudes to learning and retaining that improvement. And really just pushing it and selling it. You know, one of the things that's been great about that is the positive reward and praise that we've had to do. But that's about visibility of staff as well. You know, being able to walk around into classrooms and say, this is fantastic. You know, you are absolutely in a driven, purposeful classroom. Continues to push that message, continues to make sure that kids realise that this is what the purpose of school is. You know, when they've been sat at home in their bedroom on a laptop, I think they've realised, you know, that school's actually a pretty decent place, in the vast majority of cases anyway.
Thank you very much, Connor. I think you've given us so many ideas and made us think very much. And I think also everybody, speak for everybody, in that we really appreciate how positive you've been, that looking forward, there are opportunities. We've all been through a pretty awful time the last 18 months, but actually there is hope at the end of it. So that's really helped to get the conference off to an excellent start. And certainly at the heart of the conference is that how can we take all the positives from the experiences we've had in the pandemic and let young people and children benefit from those experiences and enable them to have an even better learning experience and more effective pastoral care and support in the future. So a big thank you to Connor, a big thank you to all our speakers this afternoon for getting the conference off to what I think has been an absolutely brilliant start. It's probably raised more questions than answers in many ways, and that's probably a good link for me to remind everybody that the next event in the conference is question time, which takes place tomorrow evening at 8 o'clock. And we've got a very distinguished and experienced lineup of experts ready to answer the questions. We're still taking questions up until midnight tonight. You don't have to sit up to midnight to do it, though. You can send your questions in now to admin@napce.org.uk, which you can see on the screen. Please send your comments on Twitter, thoughts, questions. Please send them on Twitter and use the NAPCECon21 hashtag for the conference. And just before I bring this first part of the conference to an end, can I just remind everybody that 2022 is the 40th anniversary of the National Association for Pastoral Care and Education. For 40 years, we've been promoting the importance of pastoral care and support for young people as an important part of their educational experience. And next year, we've got some exciting plans for celebrating that anniversary, including that we have got a publishing agreement with Cambridge Scholars to produce a NAPCE book, and we are also planning a live face-to-face conference. Do you remember them, when we used to meet people and actually see people? Well, that's what we're planning to happen probably around September 2022. So please keep in touch with NAPCE. We produce a free monthly newsletter which you can register for by going to admin@napce.org.uk. All we need is your permission for data protection purposes to put you on the subscribers list and an email address, and it will drop into your inbox every month with lots of interesting information, as we've had this afternoon. So all it leaves me to do really now is to thank everybody. I know we've had people mainly from the UK here today, but we have had people joining us from all around the world as well. And I look forward to you joining for us for the question time, and then for the Friday morning presentations to bring our conference to a close. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you for joining us. See you tomorrow night. Get your glass of wine ready. 8 o'clock. See you for question time. Bye-bye now.
and I'm just waiting for some time with Phil to go through my slides.
That's fine, Helen.
Hi. Damn, sorry. One of the other
Just checking,
hazards.
Phil, can I leave or does it close it down?
No, I think you can probably leave. If it does close it down,
At you.
I'll just come back. I'll just won't stop the meeting, okay?
Yeah,
I'll try it.
Thank you. Thanks, Anne.
thanks, Anne.
Ah,
I think we're all right. You're still on. No, we're all right, I think, are we?
That's good. Put the camera back on.
Good.
I know.
That was very interesting.
Yeah. You never know which direction it's going to go in, but I think it was. I think it was a good variety of speakers, which was good. And of course, the risk with a free conference is you never know how many people are going to arrive, who's going to come on the day, or who's going to watch it on the catch up. Talking of which, I'll stop recording.